Caribbeans. Yes. Okay. Here's my intro to Closing the Gap panel. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro. Two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So eloquently said by W.E.B. Du Bois in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. This is the other conversation that has been unfolding for quite some time behind the scenes at the foundation. How can we ensure proper representation of our young men of color? For those that are with us, our own young men of color in the program, with us today in the living room, this is for you. We want you to know that we see you. We need you to know we want more of you. We need to find more young men like yourselves so we can bring them into the EBF fold. The fact that we are skewing 75% female and 25% male, while for the young ladies, that's fantastic. Hello, representation. I need to see me, but I also need to see my male counterparts. So for our young men, we need that number to grow exponentially, and we will need your help to make that happen. I'd love to answer these questions. Where are our young men of color? Why are they not applying to the program in droves? Are they going to college, to graduate school? I don't know. The numbers would certainly suggest that this group is showing a decline relative to their female counterparts. It's just facts. The whole purpose of the foundation existing, in case you didn't know, if you talk to Emma, she would tell you it had everything to do with mental health and the state of affairs for our young men of color, specifically African American. Let me say that again, because I'm sure we all don't know that. It had everything to do with mental health and the state of affairs of our young African American men. That is what inspired Emma to create the foundation. Whether they were seeing themselves in front of or behind the camera, which by the way, they were not, what did that do to their self-esteem and to their confidence? Are they being written into stories or intentionally being written out of? Or is it a negative story that's being told? What does that do to one's psyche? How are we experiencing what is important to us? And does it matter to mainstream? This is the panel that will break down and peel back the onion on how we can close the gap, both in academia and in corporate. On that note, I want to issue a really warm welcome to our very own Najee, class of 2012, who will be moderating this panel. We also have Dr. Jawana Johnson, who happens to be my sorority sister and my line sister, to be exact, Greek life, who is the Chief Achievement Officer at the Eagle Academy in Harlem. We have Judge Leland McGee, adjunct professor at Rutgers University, and is also the father of our beloved Dalia McGee, the president of the Alumni Association, who also moderated yesterday's tech panel. And we have John Enyame, assistant director, Office of Workforce Partnerships, representing CUNY, the City University of New York. And bringing up the rear is George Patterson, who is the senior director of My Brother's Keeper, which is an initiative born out of President Obama's vision. So clearly, something is going on with respect to our young men of color to warrant these initiatives being created and to address the challenges and successes that our young Black men have been facing for generations, dare I say, way too long. The reason Najee was important and the perfect person to facilitate this panel is because he is a part of the community that we are trying to create a space for. In many ways, he represents intersectionality. He has used the arts to engage and cultivate community, and we are all about community here at the foundation. He is the founder and executive director of Spark House, an arts-based organization, education organization dedicated to developing our youth's voices and prompting social and emotional well-being. Amen. He is a teacher, an artist, a poet, and an activist. He is all about activating the next generation of change agents, one word at a time. I don't think anything else has to be said to prepare you all for this impactful exchange that is about to unfold. Too bad we only have an hour. Najee, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Nikki. I'm a bit overwhelmed, but just thank you. Thank you so much. I want to say I'm so honored to moderate today's panel entitled Closing the Gap. And among the many things that Nikki just shared with us, some of the words that resonated with me were, we see you and we want more of you. We see you and we want more of you. If there's anything that you can take away from today, I hope that is something that you carry with you. Closing the gap. I want to be clear that when we say the word gap, what we really mean is an unfilled space or a break in continuity. And so when we say the word close, I want to be clear that what we really mean is what is required to fill this space. And when we say the word space, I want to be clear that what we really mean is opportunity and resources. So when we say closing the gap, I want us to center today's conversation around the roles that we can play in reclaiming the narratives, taking ownership of our stories, our trajectories, our legacies, of our young men of color, and specifically our Black men and male identifying youth. Joining me in conversation today are Dr. Jawana Johnson, Leland McGee, and John Enyame, each brilliant folk who have very diverse experiences, connections to, and an understanding of the many systems, structures, and quite frankly, how the world at large has impacted and kind of sort of failed our young people. For my Emma Bowen Foundation Fellows who are tuning in, today you are going to get a chance to hear our panelists speak to their unique experiences and witnessings of how you all and your peers can navigate the rooms that you're in and understand exactly what is before you to, one, make use of this information and also the resources available to become the best versions of yourselves that you can possibly imagine. This is what we mean by closing the gap. For my panelists, I want to encourage you to view today and our time together as less of a traditional panel and more as a group conversation. My hope is that the exchange of ideas that happens today will result in a conversation that's engaging, informative, and inspiring. To kick us off, for my panelists, I'd love for each of you all to go around, and if you could just share one thing that you're looking forward to bringing to today's conversation. I'll start. I'll say that I'm looking forward to bringing an open heart and an open ear to today's conversation. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Good afternoon. I'm looking forward to bringing an open perspective, as well as kind of a pipeline to the women, the mothers, the aunties, the godmothers who support the young men, and who are present also alongside of the young men as they engage in this battle or struggle.
Thank you for that. John?
Hello, thank you, everyone. Really glad to be part of this panel and the conversation that we'll be having. What I'm hoping to bring to this conversation and hope others are able to walk away with as well is vulnerability. Just being able to embrace vulnerability when we talk about the spaces that we aim to be in, are currently in, and just being vulnerable with how we are sharing our narratives.
Thank you for that. And Leland.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I guess I may be telling a story I shouldn't be telling, but I happened to be on a conversation with my daughter, with Stacey Abrams. And in that conversation, someone asked her what gives her hope. And she said she doesn't have hope. She said what she has is determination. And so what I'm hoping is to bring an understanding of what the value of determination is to get to the next level.
Thank you all for that. So what I'm hearing from the group today is support, a pipeline, vulnerability, understanding, and more. I think those are good anchors for the conversation, and it feels like we can jump right in. Would you agree? All right, good. Okay, so each of you wears many hats. We wouldn't have enough time to go through all of them, but I know amongst the three of you, we have educators, youth advocates, attorneys, strategists, tech gurus, professors, administrators, students, parents, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And so I'm wondering, in your line of work and in the many roles that you all assume, what are some of the current narratives that exist today around our young Black men, and from which lens is this being told? Anyone can jump in.
So I guess I'll start. I am the Chief Achievement Officer for the Eagle Academy Foundation. And for those who don't know, the Eagle Academy Foundation serves and supports the Eagle Academies. And the Eagle Academies are a network of 6 all-male secondary schools, serving grades 6 through 12 across the 5 boroughs and in Newark, New Jersey. And so when I think about the narrative for young Black and Latino men in the world, the narrative a lot of times is that these young men are trouble, that these young men are they are more likely to be suspended, they are more likely to be truant, they are more likely to be involved in court involved or school related circumstances and situations. And one of the things that I'm pleased and proud of is that at the Eagle Academies, one of the things that we pride ourselves in is really being able to challenge that narrative and to provide a space that allows young men to just be themselves, to laugh, to joke, to play, to wrestle, because it's an all-boys school, and to really kind of engage academically, socially, and really kind of grow and flourish in a space that accepts and acknowledges them for who they are. But the external narrative is not one that is incredibly supportive.
I'll jump in. I respond to that question reluctantly because I think we spend more time talking about the negative narratives than we ought to. And I think that, I'm looking forward to us having more conversations about what the narrative is that we really want to see. But I can tell you firsthand that despite being second generation college, second generation law school, second generation judge, having degrees from 2 different Ivy League schools, when I walk down the street, I'm still scared. And so, and I had a conversation with a colleague recently, a very frank conversation, who made clear how true that still is. And so as we go through this conversation today, I look forward to talking more about, how we deal with that fact on a day-to-day basis.
So far, wonderful shares by Dr. Jawana Johnson and also Leland. To add to that, from my perspective, my observation, I believe like the narrative changes based off of the grouping of young Black males that we're looking at. When they're very young, I would say like in the late elementary going to middle school, there is kind of like a hint of hope that they are still retaining like some innocence of being a young child, and that there's a hope that they will be able to pursue the aspirations kind of like set for them if they have not identified it for themselves. When as they get older and they're in the middle school, high school, getting ready to transition, I think that Dr. Johnson, she certainly hit the nail on the head, as she should, because of the direct work that she's done with that grouping over the years. And then what I'm seeing, having worked in higher ed, and also working in the private sector, watching and encouraging young, Black women and men to come into the tech sector and other tangential areas around tech. The thing that keeps coming up when it comes to young Black men in particular is where are they? And it comes up in different ways. There's this idea, and even though it may not be spoken outwardly, there's this idea that there aren't enough Black men capable in pursuing paths seen as atypical for Black men to pursue, whether it be in the range of sectors, tech, finance, whatever. Even though we do, we are there, we here, right? But there still is this faint, maybe a little bit more than faint, kind of like feeling that's emoted in conversations around how to identify talent, how to bring on more folks into a space around young Black men. That where are they? There aren't enough. They're not only not interested, but there aren't enough with the capability to come into this space, when it's simply not true. Absolutely, not true. So those are things that I would like for us to be able to not just deconstruct, but just kind of like rid away with in conversations that we in the different circles that we're in, whether in professional space, academic space, and even directly with the population, the community that we're supporting.
Thank you for that, John. And I just wanted to give a quick welcome to George Patterson, who just joined us. Welcome, George.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you. So just to catch you up to speed, we were just starting the conversation talking about the current narrative or narratives that exist specifically around our young Black men. Dr. Johnson, Leland, and John were given some context from just what they have experienced around the narratives. And what I was hearing from you all were narratives around where young Black men are more likely to end up, around some of the challenges and obstacles that they may be faced with. John, you talked about the change in the narrative that may happen over the scope of time. And Leland, you brought in a perspective that is a good segue for where I'd like to go next, around the narratives that we would like to see, right? Or some of the least common narratives that are actually out there in the forefront. And so my question is, and Nikki brought this up earlier, because I'm a words person, I'm an artist, right? And so storytelling and who gets to tell the story is really important to me. And I'm a big proponent of this idea of reclaiming narrative, right? And so my question for the group would be, given your experience and your witnessings, what are some ways in which our young people can reclaim ownership over their own narratives?
I want to know if I can either jump in first, or George, since you're first coming, would you like to take the lead on that? Yeah.
So that's an interesting question. And we all know what the data is showing. So how do we reclaim our narrative? I can tell you, first and foremost, let me introduce myself, and sorry for the tardiness. I'm on vacation down here in Atlanta and trying to get set up. But my name is George Patterson. I'm the senior director of My Brother's Keeper in New York City, and I work for the New York City Department of Education. And I'm a longtime administrator, a longtime principal in the city. And, you know, the story that's told is the story that we all know. It's a story of one of our boys and young men of color often having difficulty adapting to the current system that's in place. So how do we retell, reclaim, change the narrative, change the story? One of the things that we've been greatly pushing with My Brother's Keeper is allowing or trying to get, and there's certain systems that we have in place like New York Men's Teach. You know, the data shows that across the country, 80% of our young men are taught by, you know, white women, and often middle-class white women. And only, I think it's less than 5% of our Black men are actually taught by Black male teachers. So understanding the culture of where our young men come from, and I know that's something that Jawana and Eagle Academy are all over. When it comes to like the culturally relevant, sustaining education, when it comes to putting students in the center of their learning, hearing their voices, when it comes to creating like those type of system and structures, like what exactly are we doing? Like what systems are in place that prevent access to these pipelines that we're seeing, like the school to prison pipeline? So one of the things that we're really targeting is more mentorship programs, more rites of passage programs, more culturally relevant, sustaining education, and more equity, diversity, and inclusion. And like, how does that play out? What systems need to be in place for that to happen? And these come with many challenges. And I could tell you on a New York City level, we actually had our mayor and school chancellor like fighting a good fight just to try to get more access in the specialized high schools for Black and brown, not just young men, but young people of color. And, you know, so again, that was the fight they fought, but unfortunately they didn't win. So what we want to see is more representation on like the higher levels, upper management, I would say. And what we also want to see, it's difficult when you have people who don't know the culture being charged with teaching the culture. You know, like it's one of the only systems in New York that's majority Black and brown, but majority taught by non-Black and brown, but they're expected to know the culture and teach under the umbrella of the culture, which can make it very difficult in telling those stories. So how do we change that? A lot more professional development is needed, and a lot more structural change is needed in terms of hiring practices. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, John.
Oh yeah, you know, I gotta say, part of me is kind of saying to myself, I should have gone first. I mean, George, you hit a lot of things, you know, that had two of which that I wanted to mention was presence, you want having presence, and then the second item is like just navigating, navigating the space. There's a third piece that I will add to that, but when it comes to like presence, this is one thing that I found that definitely impacted me as I was, you know, coming up and I was moving into different places, stages. You know, I in any space that I walk into now as an adult, as a professional, as a person in tech and working with folks outside tech, I walk in showing my presence in terms of like what are the things that I know of myself that I claim that I'm bringing into the conversation, and that you're not just getting to know me just as a face, but you're getting to know me in terms of like the background. So what I typically say is I will say in my bios and also in conversations, hey, how you doing? My name is John. I am a first generation Ghanaian, American. I am Brooklyn born, Bronx bred, and it lends texture to what are the things that I've learned about myself, that I know about myself, that I'm putting forward. And so being able to have that presence and coaching our young men to be able to own their presence and put it forward in the different spaces that they're in, it provides such a compound benefit for them and how they see themselves. It is certainly important, yes, for young men to be able to model behaviors, to model activities and in folks who've already walked the walk, who are already kind of like traveled and reached certain points within their maturity and career, education, and such. But in the times in which that is not available, it becomes it's a challenge for young men to figure out themselves and figure out like how do they step forward. So George, you mentioned that providing the statistic of the number of what is the presentation in terms of teachers and their background to students. So a great majority are taught by white females, white women in the space, and there are not enough young men in which they can feel as though they emulate and see themselves maturing and moving into a greater space of like professionalism. I'm a big fan of New York City Men Teach. But we also need to be able to have other avenues where young men can kind of like figure it out or see that those tools are being presented to them and then make those connections to be able to own their presence and push forward their presence. The second piece is the navigation. It is, I'm going to say, it's almost slightly tragic actually to be a person who comes up through the public school system and not see enough of themselves like in the system, kind of like teaching and coaching them and bringing them up. And it's also somewhat tragic where you mentioned, George, folks who are in those positions to teach young men, and many are trying to do the best they can, but without having like intimate insight into the culture and also the challenges in which young men and young women, of course, Black men and women, but for this conversation, young men would face as they are moving through a system. They're not they're not able to fully coach those young men on how to navigate the system, on how to be made aware of things, measures, obstacles that were, put in place, whether they're explicit or tacit, put in place, before they were born. And, we have to be able to do more work around providing some coaching and providing some tools to be able to navigate, the system that they are subject to. And I'm just going to try to make this shorter for the essence of time. The last piece is there are certain things I try to impart into the students that I work with, and I try to make it almost like a jingle type, something that they can remember and like move forward with. One of those items is build work, study. So in any system that a person is a part of, in order to be able to create confidence and then mastery and then be able to fully contribute within the system and feel as though that there is some value that can be extracted or just being given back. You have to be able to understand what role do you play. Are you helping to build the system? Are you just working within the system? Are you studying the system? And I'm not sure that I know that there's work around that, but there's not enough work on like making that very, very clear to our young men to say, you have to understand the role that you're currently playing. Are you studying the system so that you understand what to look out for, how to contribute? Are you just working within the system? Do not settle, too much in just working in the system? Are you providing an opportunity to build and contribute towards the system, or build another pathway for individuals that are within the system? So I hope that was helpful in terms of a share. I will end my time for my peers.
Thank you for that, John. And I just wanted to say what I was hearing so far, two important things about understanding. So George, you talked about understanding the culture. And I think one of the powerful things that you said was people who don't know the culture being charged with teaching the culture. And John, this last point that you talked about in terms of understanding the role that you're playing within the system, if you're studying it, if you are working within it, or if you're abolishing and restructuring and creating alternative pathways as ways of thinking about ways to approach this idea of reclaiming narrative. So I just wanted to thank you both for those anchors that you placed. And I think, Dr. Johnson, I think you were just about to say something. Am I correct?
Yes.
Please, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. I would just add, I think how we create and provide explicit opportunities for young men's voices to be lifted up. One of the things that we found is that in these gendered spaces or in these affinity groups, so spaces where young men are together, that they are more likely to tell, construct, craft, and even refine their stories. And so how we think about that. And then if I think about Emma Bowen and I think about this platform of media outlets, and we think about these various sources and opportunities for the messaging to get out, the more times you can go directly to the source and have the young man actually share his perspective, his story, I think that is how we shift the narrative. So people are not necessarily relying so much on the numbers, but we're relying on the stories that go with the numbers. We're hearing directly from the young men themselves what are the things that they need. At Eagle, we've done this thing called Town Hall, where we have our young men, our ambassadors, who are lifted up, and they did a whole web series during the pandemic, which literally was about staying clear through crisis, young men lifting up their voices during the time. And it was young men led, it was youth led, it was youth sponsored, it was youth focused. And so that's a way that we start to shift the narratives. If I think about George's point around representation mattering, but specifically representation at the higher levels. So in these affinity groups where young men are getting empowered and they're finding their voice, establishing their voice, and sharing their voice, we also have to talk about the people who don't look like the young men of color. So the Black women who are in the room, the white men who are in the room, the white women who are in the room, the conversation has to still center around how and where do we support young men of color? And in that conversation, again, it can't be a conversation that is void of the voice of young men. So there have to be opportunities to hear the perspectives of these young men, but the people who have access to really change, to change, shift, and modify the system, and even, I dare say, disrupt the system, they also have to be having those conversations in the places where Black men, young Black men currently do not exist in larger numbers. The last thing I would add is that I would be remiss as a member of the academy, quote unquote, to just talk about this notion of the creation of knowledge. When we talk about changing the narrative, a lot of times when we think about school systems and structures, they refer to research-based practices and how we align to research-based practices. We have to be in the academy. We have to pursue higher degrees. We have to write. We have to share our stories. We've got to do master's theses. We have to do doctorates, because we have to create the knowledge. We are keepers of the knowledge, and they're different. And if we keep the knowledge to ourselves and the things that we learn and the ways we understand our stories, our dynamics, our interactions, what are the supports? If we only have other people telling our story, then it's a challenge. I think there's a phrase that says, as long as the hunter tells the story, the lion will always be a victim. And so we have to think about the ways that we both construct knowledge and secure it in the places that people deem valid. And I understand that there are some schools of thought that say, well, we've got to disrupt the system, break the system up. And so I think we can do both. I think we can work within the system and really kind of write about and study and engage ourselves in the work, in the prospect, in the perspectives that builds that body of knowledge that then people can go to and they can refer to as they start to expand and think about programmatic interventions.
Thank you for that. Dr. Johnson. And I love that you said, I think we can do both, right? And the Libra in me got really excited. Thinking about this balance. Yeah, we're there.
I'm a Libra.
There we go. See, I knew I felt the synergy happening. But thinking about this idea of working within the system and also being able to shape our own, right? And so one of the things that you said is we are keepers of the knowledge and we have to be creators of the knowledge, right? And so when I think about who is creating this collectively, it makes me think of the word village. And I'm curious to know what the word village means to you all and how you all see the village playing a role in creating this narrative, this new narrative. Leland, can I turn it over to you?
Sure, you can turn it. I will build on what's already been said and be brief so as not to repeat it all. But, one thing that was mentioned was presence. And I will try to keep your question in mind as I say this. Presence is really key for reclaiming our narrative, and it also is important to your question. I work as the Diversity and Inclusion Fellow at Graduate School of Ed at Penn, and I don't see enough of us. And so we do need to be present. The other thing that's really important is how we show up. And so in the academy, the village are those folks who have the ability to support how we show up. The village are all those folks who give us that guidance about what showing up really means and the spaces in which we need to be present, and exactly how we do that. There are people who say I've achieved a lot, right? But I will offer to you that there's nothing that I have done that didn't come from the benefit of both my faith and people who have faith in me. And in most of the spaces that I've ended up in, it's been because someone saw something in me that I may not have seen. And my faith drove me to follow the calling that was before me. And so the village plays a role in helping us see those things in ourselves that we need to take advantage of, use, build upon, expand, grow into, develop, and share. So as we're learning, we're also helping others to learn. So the village is broad. Not all of those people who saw something in me look like me. And we have to not be afraid to recognize that and take advantage of the opportunities when they present themselves. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. George?
Wow, that was very well said. So I'm going to continue on this theme of presence also, because I think that's the one of the goals of the village. That's one of the goals of us coming together and forming organizations, and then having those organizations partnership with other organizations, not be in competition with, but collaborate with, because we all have the same purpose and the same goals, which is to change what's happening with our students of color. So I want to give an example, and this came to me just the other day. When you look at the higher levels of management within the New York City Department of Education, and you look at the chancellors, the chancellor, the deputy chancellors, the executive superintendents, the executive directors, and the superintendents, and you think about all of those positions, and you think about, well, how many Black men are in those positions? And you probably won't get more you could probably count the amount of Black men with just a couple of fingers that are in that have. So, one of the things you have to say to yourself is, well, how serious is this system about diversity, about equity, when they're not living out sometimes what they're speaking? So in terms of the village, we have to make sure that we have a seat at the table when decisions are being made. So when upper management decisions are being made, like, who's making those decisions? They shouldn't be kept a secret. And if there are, Black men of color who have the qualifications to at least apply to get in those positions, because our boys and young men of color need to see us on those levels. Because if we're not reaching those levels, then you have to look back and say, okay, well, how does the principalship look? And how many of us are in those, are in those positions? So when I see the village, I see really advocacy, right? I see the village is there to advocate really for like injustice, really to advocate for equity and equality. And how do we create this, they like to use the term to like reimagine the system, and to Dr. Johnson's point, it's like, well, how do we abolish and reimagine at the same time to make sure that there is diversity, so that we can just walk the walk and not just talk the talk.
I love that. Thank you. I love this idea of abolish and reimagining simultaneously, right? Sometimes we think that only one thing can happen over the other, or things are mutually exclusive. But this idea of these things working in tandem together in order to re-envision this future that we see for ourselves. So thank you for that. John or Dr. Johnson, if you want to add anything before I move on.
Yes, I think I would just add that I think that the village actually is everyone. And so this idea of who are the members of the village, I think sometimes what happens is we start to qualify who are the people who can be in the village. So we're like, okay, well, we want to include this group, but not that group. So your barbers, your electricians, your professional men, your lawyers, your doctors, your teachers, they are all part of the village. And so when we think about the village that wraps around and supports young men as they find their way and navigate, I think we've got to think about that. I think we also have to think about the opportunity youth. So those young people for whom school might not have been the ideal place for them or the ideal pathway, and what happens for them. There's an African proverb that says that young people who are on outside of the village will often burn down the village to feel its warmth. And so this notion of how we re-engage opportunity youth, how do we provide pipeline programs for young men who may have had some disruptions in their education, or who may have decided not to go directly to college, but thinking about ways that we continue to wrap around and layer and lend support. I would say parallel conversations could be had for young Black women as well. But the focus of this conversation is really around Black men. But if we think about that, if we think about, to Leland's point, the members of the village who don't look like us, who might live in a village adjacent to our village, and how we leverage those people for allyships, for resources, but also for a greater and a deeper understanding. But I think understanding that everyone technically is part of the village. And when we think about the influences on our young people, sometimes we overlook the places where we can have more positive influences and positive pouring in to young people. And then we neglect the fact that some of the young people who manifest themselves through some negative choices, a lot of times it's because we've decided that they are not part of the village.
Very well said, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for that. I love this idea of the village is everyone. And thinking of that, I want to turn it over to our village of fellows. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I'd love to open the floor for you all to ask any questions that you may have to the panelists, and we will try our best to get them over to you. So some questions have already been coming in, and I want to let you know, going back to what Nikki said earlier, we see you and we want more of you, right? So keep pouring that in the chat. Dr. Johnson, you talked about this idea of the influence in our spaces. And so Alexander has a question, and this is for everyone. how important are full family units with both parents, and how important is that to the development of young Black men, and how can we further encourage that?
I would say that full family units are important to all children. But I would also say what the research shows is that if you have one parent there, one parent can get the job done. I would say what's equally, or if not more important, is is attending like schools that have a plan for our young Black males, schools that have standards, curriculum that match, that's well aligned with the standards, schools that are able to give students extra help, and schools that have qualified teachers that have majored or at least all have become experts in the field that they're teaching. And I would say that to me matters almost just as much as a full family structure. We need to make sure that the schools have a plan and are able to carry out and have the resources to meet the needs and the challenges of our boys and young men of color.
You know, I would say that I think the question around the village is really the answer to that question. Because I would say no, it's not essential, because I know a lot of very successful Black men who only have one parent. But it's the village that supported and buttressed them. I think that the education process needs to move in a direction of embracing outside of the four walls of a building as part of the education process. And so I think that to the extent that as learners, we think about being able to learn beyond the classroom, beyond the person standing up in front of the classroom, and embrace the fact that we can learn from our colleagues and from the barbers and the folks in the community. We will expand that family. And that's what I think the support of the village is all about.
I wanted to quickly jump in, and both George and Leland, I think, and I'm sure Dr. Johnson will probably be on band with this. The family structure, sure, there is an impact when it is, and there are some, there's a form of adversity that is faced when it's a one parent versus two parent, but you can still have adversity in a two parent household. That, being in the nuclear family doesn't mean that it is not without its challenges. And so what's more important, I believe, is how is the child or children being equipped to face and grow in the world that they're in? What means of support do they have access to? How are they being coached to think about their circumstances, good or bad, make connections between what they know to explore the things that they do not know that will help them move towards spaces that they wish to be in, or move into spaces that they hadn't considered themselves to be in, and still be able to work through that. I feel as though when it comes to the village piece, let's, and this is to Alex, I guess, who asked this question. Let's move this village idea and say that the child, the young person, can take the village with them. They can build the village where they go. So it's not only where they're coming from and who they have access to, but also have they developed? Have they been helped to develop enough of the awareness to identify folks who not only look to have their best interests and support their best interests, but will also kind of like direct them into new experiences, or be able to share their perspective on experiences that they ordinarily, the child ordinarily, or young person ordinarily wouldn't put themselves in. So you have such great power, and I think that's something that we need to be able to not only share, but put some emphasis on for young Black men and young Black women, but that you have so much power in building a village as you go if you understand like what is it that you need and who are the folks who have shown that they have your best interest in mind.
Thank you all for that. Delia McGee, another McGee, has a question. And she asks, how can I, as a Black woman and an alum, help close the gap within the Emma Bowen Foundation space? And I think, Dr. Johnson, that speaks to some of what you were breaking up before around the role of, we're centering this conversation around our young Black men, but obviously we know that there are other people that play a role in this as well. And so I'm wondering if you or anyone else can speak to that.
Yes, absolutely. The first thing that I would say in your explicit role, I think it is thinking about where there are opportunities to introduce voices, for you to be a voice in a room for people who are not present. And so if you're in, and while I apologize for not knowing your specific space or capacity, but if you're in a room and there's an opportunity that is presented, thinking about, is there another young person of color whose name could also be lifted up? Also thinking about how you blaze the trail for young people. There are also opportunities for you to serve and to mentor in different schools and in different places, providing some more explicit support. But I think the biggest thing is really just kind of being an advocate for young people. The other thing is the young men who are part of your family, finding an opportunity to pause and take time. I'm a forever teacher, so I don't actually walk away from young men when I see them clustered on a train or wherever. And so I'm good to engage people in conversation. And I think one of the things that happens for young Black men is a lot of times they are not seen. And so we don't see them in a place, but they're not seen. So people will walk away, will avoid, but engaging them in conversations that are aligned and around their interest will allow you to sometimes help to push their thinking, but also it helps to give you some insight into where are the different ways that I can be a connector. I can serve as a resource, a greater resource to them. And then, just love them.
I like how Dr. Johnson punctuated that with just love them. So I think that find other folks who are also asking the same question, like the question that's burning in you to figure out like how can I help? Are there other folks who are also trying to figure it out? And that way you can be able to band with them in addressing the challenge. If you do not have or find anyone readily, to band with, I would say yes. The conversations, like having the conversation and starting like those small connection with another person, another pairing young man with older gentleman that's in the space, pairing young person with opportunity, and then providing some kind of like context around how to navigate. Because I also find this to be a challenge where there are times when folks who want to help, like they'll bring things up to a point and then maybe kind of like drop it on the young person's lap to say, okay, you should be able to figure it out from here. And you have to acknowledge that there may be some more hand-holding required, more connection to resource so that they can figure it out, and providing that level of education of like what resources are available, whether it be tech tool persons, or even just understanding how to piece things together. So that's my thought, and I end.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, but I'm looking at the clock and we've got 5 minutes left. The conversation is just rolling. And I feel like we barely scratched the surface, but I think that there was some really, really good gems that we were able to touch on I want to briefly thank Zion and Terion for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them directly, but I will say that we have them over at a separate file, a separate tab on my computer. And if that's okay with you all, I might just share these with the panelists and we can find a way to get that over to you, because we want to make sure that you all are seen and heard today. Your voices are seen and heard. For all of my Emma Bowen Foundation fellows who are tuning in, I would like you to do me a favor and just drop one word in the chat that describes how you're feeling after listening and tuning into today's session. Any word. We just want to know kind of what the response is. And for my panelists, to help close us out, I'm going to ask you all to complete the following phrase: in order to close the gap, ... So I'm going to ask you to, one person to jump in, and then if you could pass it over to the next panelist.
I'll popcorn it. Okay. So first and foremost, invest and practice mental health. I think that's incredibly important for our young men to get into the practice of doing that early, because it's one of many things that has like a compound benefit, like down the line. And it's an area of vulnerability that all persons of color tend to maybe shy away from until at a later point. But if you can start on investing and practicing like mental health now, it would be great.
Dr. Johnson?
I would say in order to close the gap, what I would say is take full advantage of all opportunities, leverage your relationships, be strategic around the relationships, think about where it is you want to go, and reach out to someone and say, can I have a 2-minute conversation with you? Can I have a 5-minute conversation with you to understand, to garner a deeper understanding? I would also say that this notion of how you think about love, how you love yourself, how you love others, and how you are a stand for love, how you embrace support. Sometimes it takes a couple of bites at the apple. And then finally, this notion of failure and understanding that just because, the most successful people have failed maybe 7 times before they succeeded on the 8th time. And sometimes it's 99 times they fail before they've succeeded. But persistence and continuing to pursue the goal and really being able to love and support the young men who are in your sphere, and understand, as John mentioned, that sometimes they need some additional support. And it is the same level of support that other communities provide for their people. Sometimes we rely on people or expect people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But sometimes we've got to support them and love them until they understand what their full capacity is, and they're able to do it on their own.
Thank you. We'll go to Leland and then George.
To the fellows, I echo Dr. Johnson. Determination, stay focused, be intentional, make every blow a telling blow. I mean, words matter. And if you're going to use them, make them count for something. So when you step up, when you're present, be intentional and make sure that there's a value to what you're bringing to the table. But you have to take advantage of opportunities that present themselves.
I'll end it off by saying, first of all, I agree. What everyone said was correct, but please understand that to close this achievement gap, understand that the system of education that you are currently in often blames you for the system failures. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you. In fact, some may argue that you guys are too good for the system that currently exists. So what happens when students are not engaged in school? They begin to talk too much, right? They begin to tap their fingers. They may misbehave. But what happens when students are engaged, right? When they see themselves in the text that they're reading, when they have teachers that can relate to them. So that's why you notice, students who are Jewish attend yeshivas so they could get that connection. They could learn their history. So just understand that you guys are brilliant beyond belief. Keep doing what you're doing and put pressure on the school leaders that are in front of you to teach the way you want to learn.
Wonderfully said. And on that note, I want to close by saying I'm incredibly moved by the depth of today's conversation. Nikki, thank you for being the visionary leader that you are and trusting me to facilitate today's space. To my panelists, Dr. Johnson, Leland, John, and George, thank you for your transparency. Thank you for your truth and for your daily commitment to our youth and their futures. To all of my Emma Bowen Foundation fellows, thank you for your engagement, for your questions, for showing up today at your internships, but most important, for choosing to show up for yourselves every day. Our world and our futures are brighter and brighter because of you. My hope is that this conversation has been able to shed some light on where we are today and leaves you not only encouraged, but inspired to keep doing the work and pushing forward. Best of luck in all of your pursuits and see you next year.
Najee, you completely exceeded my expectations. You already know I see you. I saw you years ago. I saw your value. So for you to be able to come back and pull off what you did, I recognize all you were able to do was scratch the surface. There's so much more to be said and unpacked. And we'll have to figure out how to do a part 2 at a later date. Thank you so much.
Of course, anytime.
Well, bravo, bravo, brava. Because I got to shout out my soror. Truer words never spoken. We all have a part to play in closing the gap. I need my young ladies in the program to go back wherever it is you came from, wherever it is you call home and you stomp on the ground. I need you to go and talk up what we do at the foundation and bring your male counterparts with you into the fold. For our young men, shout out to my 25%. I'm gonna need you to see yourselves as having some skin in this game. I need you to wear your recruiter's hat no differently than the team at EBF wears their recruiter hat. And I appreciate they get paid for it. Howsoever, we already know part of lifting as you climb and paying it forward means you have to have a place in the sun. You have to appreciate the legacy of the foundation, which will remain true. And considering where we started, as I said earlier, around Emma's wishes, we all have to get in this gap so we can close it. All right, here we go. One of the things I'm going to say, as I've already thanked you all for this dynamic panel, is I'm going to end with what Dr. Johnson said. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.